This video is brought to you by GameMaker, the free, fast, and easy-to-use 2D game engine that helps power modern classics like Undertale, Hotline Miami, and Hyper Light Drifter. Starter templates, official asset bundles, and a wealth of tutorials are available to help bring your ideas to life. And you can export and share your game for free on all non-console platforms. But you don't have to take my word for it, I'm just some jerk. We have an actual bona fide game maker on hand.
Oh shit, that's me. Yes, I've been using GameMaker for a long time. It's probably the most powerful and easiest to use engine for making 2D games out there, suitable for both amateurs and hardcore coders, and with all the Steam and console integration stuff for when you're ready to start monetizing your hobbies. I used it to make my recently released game, Starstruck Vagabond, which has already delighted thousands of sci-fi cozy game aficionados thanks to GameMaker being so bloody great.
Head on over to the GameMaker link in the description to begin your game development journey today.
Oh my god, hello, and welcome to DevHeads, the podcast focused on the ins, outs, and goings on in game development, with host experience ranging from indie, double to AAA. I'm Jay, joined by my wonderful hosts as usual, Tina.
Hi, I didn't realize we were live already.
No, well, we
silly
transitioned
faces?
into being live. We were having our art chat shortly before. And Mikey.
Dignified chat.
Yeah.
Hello, I'm Mikey.
And today we're joined by a good friend of mine, Mr. Feral Prony. Mr. Brian Feeney, how are you?
I am doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've been wanting to have you on for a long time, so it's really good to get you on. First of all, I just want to apologize to chat. Our wonderful producer, as you all know, Eric, got attacked by internet terrorists and who destroyed his, not actual internet terrorists, who destroyed some, fiber cable near his house, which absolutely ransacked it. It looked like everything was going to be okay, and then suddenly it wasn't. So I've had to take over from the stream. So if it doesn't look as professional, or we don't have any good clips and stuff like that, that's on me. It's not on Eric. But yes, we're here. We're here to talk about the spice. Tina, you suggested that we talk about our spicy title right off the get-go, so we can move on.
Well, I wanted to back up a little bit. So, Brian, you work at Riot Games as a game director on Wild Rift.
Not anymore. I used to. I was
Okay.
the game director on Wild Rift. But yeah, now I'm working on a title fluctuates, but basically game designer / director. I've worked on several unannounced and several canceled titles. But before that, I was the game director on Wild Rift, and then before that, I was a design lead on League of Legends.
Okay, so you're on something unannounced.
I am on something unannounced, unfortunately.
And
okay, cool.
for our viewers, Wild Rift is the mobile version of League of Legends, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah.
Beautiful. Which
leads us to the
Yeah.
title.
does
AAA need mobile?
does AAA need mobile? Yeah.
Okay. I gotta put an immediate disclaimer on this. I am not representing Riot Games' corporate strategy in any way on this. Right, so anything on here is gonna obviously be my opinion on this. I also, so I spent time working on League of Legends, but then also League of Legends Mobile. I think the short answer to the question is AAA Mobile is a pretty interesting space. There's not a lot of folks that I would say are actively competing in it. I actually think Mihoyo, like Honkai Star Rail, Genshin Impact are probably actually the closest consistent kind of AAA kind of folks that have 100, 300 person plus dev teams that are operating in mobile. But I think this is an area that teams are kind of continuing to kind of experiment in. We saw a bunch of pushes with Blizzard. What was the name of their the Warcraft Rumble?
Warcraft Rumble, Diablo Immortal,
recently.
Stuff like that.
Diablo Immortal, right? So there's a lot of interest in this space. I think do they need it? I would say the answer is no. Right? Do they want it? I think the answer is yes, right? And for a variety of very logical reasons. One, more players are shifting to mobile, although I think some of that has slowed. I think other sectors of the industry are growing faster in some cases. Oddly, board games are growing really fast, right? Oddly. But then also there are other spaces where it's there are certain if you want to be a globally facing company, there are certain regions in the world that are predominantly mobile or predominantly console or predominantly PC. And so if you don't kind of have access to different kind of platforms and in different kinds of platforms, you just really can't sort of hit a global audience. So want, yes. Need, probably no.
Yeah. What kind of regions are more mobile focused? I think it's quite a bit of the East is quite focused on mobile, isn't it?
China has a huge market for mobile, in addition to just PC gaming.
Yeah, China's like obviously a huge mobile market.
India.
Yeah, India as well. There are other spaces that I think are like almost entirely mobile based. Like a lot of areas in like Southeast Asia are entirely almost mobile based.
Okay.
There are also other regions that are predominantly more console. There's also like there's a lot of oddities. I don't actually have like recent updated figures, so I don't want to spew any misinformation about particular countries and their demographic breakdown of preferred gaming consoles. But it varies
Can you
a
tell us
lot.
one of the oddities before you continue? Like, what was one where you were like, oh, I didn't realize that was a big enough market to justify being this high on the chart, or how you might say it?
That's a good question. I'm pretty out of date on the console space, but that was usually where I found the most oddities, where you'd be like, oh, Xbox is actually super popular in this region, even if it has less market share than PlayStation overall, and sort of how those console breakdowns occurred between different regions. There was like a big push, for example, to get the Switch into China. I don't think there were any other consoles that sort of made a push there. I don't know how successful that was, but it just generally kind of that was the biggest thing where you get odd demographic breakdowns between platforms.
And those big decisions because porting a gargantuan game that also has incredibly difficult like onboarding and UX, deciding to port that to mobile is like a huge decision, right? There's like financially and also just like team power wise. Would you say, well, a lot of the times with most companies, the decisions to make these are initially, we want to reach this demographic, this kind of audience. Was that do you remember that being a big internal decision, having to have that chat, or was it something that was just like, let's see if this will work kind of thing?
Yeah, I think Riot's a bit of an odd duck, I think, in sort of the AAA space. And I think the general impetus for like, let's go into mobile is someone sees a chart and it's like, PC gamers, mobile gamers, and they're like, oh, it's twice the money. Like, we want the money. And so they kind of go for it. Riot was pretty late to the mobile space and the mobile market. And I think it really kind of came out more from this sort of like, we do a lot of like player listening and sort of like trying to gather like what player feedback and what they want. And the ask for League of Legends on mobile was consistently growing for years until it kind of hit a point where like, oh yeah, this is something that players actually really want, so we should sort of make this. It was sort of more like a player focused kind of bottom up decision rather than like a top down, let's look at the kind of the market.
That's really refreshing to hear, rather than it just being like this only the decision of the suits looking at things and going, there's money to be had here. It's more of like, our players, what you're listening to your players, and there's clearly a want for it. So, you can make both of those decisions, right?
Yeah. And some of that I think varied from, there were certain regions that were shifting more and more towards mobile. But there were also just like, I think more, I don't have the right term for it, more like kind of anecdotal, just like, certain players, probably some in this room, kind of hitting that age demographic where it's just kind of like we don't really have the time or the space to like sit down in front of a PC for 2 hours and just like kind of play consistently. But I really still love League, and I still really love that kind of like competitive spirit. It's like, can I get something that delivers that experience in a shorter time period, or potentially even like on the go? There's one of the producers I worked with on Wild Rift was like, like literally like play testing on his phone, like with his baby like kind of across his arms, right? And it was just like that's something he couldn't do on sort of a PC. So there's a lot of sort of like different kind of like player needs and motivations for why they would want something on mobile.
Would holding a baby reduce toxicity? I feel like it would, because you're getting pissed. You're playing a combo. Fucker. Oh no.
Oh no, I've got a cute baby.
All right, I have other things going on that are important.
I don't have a kid myself, but I would probably think that it probably does not reduce toxicity or stress while you're playing a game of League of Legends. However, it is harder to type.
True.
But I don't know.
Yeah.
I know, Tina, you're a parent. If you want to have any commentary.
And you were playing Wild Rift, right?
I was playing last week.
Yeah.
And the week before, just because I'm struggling to find something where I can sit down and play. Mm-hmm. And mobile games are just like a new avenue for me because I have under 2, which is insane. It's like playing on hardcore mode in real life. But yeah, I picked it up and I was like, this is cool, because my husband plays a bunch of League, and I've dabbled in it. But in terms of MOBAs, like jumping into this one on mobile it had a really good tutorial.
Mm-hmm.
And I really appreciated it. The one thing that I'm trying to nail down is all the terminology. I'm still kind of new to that. Like, I know jungling because that's just something I naturally wanted to do when I first started playing League, like 10, 15 years, 15 years
Might
ago.
have been. It's an old game.
The alarm in your voice.
I was just like, oh my god. But yeah, no, it's really cool.
I think something that's really interesting is that what we were talking about just then, Brian, when you said, having a baby in your arm and being able to play it on mobile is something you couldn't necessarily do on PC, but very famously for games like MOBAs or MMOs or any game like that, there's a lot of like keybinds and interactions and like map movement and stuff like that you have to do with a mouse and keyboard. Wasn't that difficult to transition into the mobile space? Because to me that seems like the biggest challenge of trying to make this work.
Kind of. I don't think it was actually the hardest challenge. So this is actually kind of more where my focus was on. Like I was the game director and I was the design lead before that. So I was mostly focused for the first couple years when we were doing prototyping and kind of really on that kind of core game loop. And like my specific job when I kind of got pulled over there was like, hey, you want to come over here for like 3 weeks and just like make the game feel like League? Was sort of like the initial task. And like that ended up being actually harder for people who don't play MOBAs. So you're point, they are very, very intricate games, many systems that overlap in sort of different ways. And one of the hardest things about it, both in terms of like character feel and how the characters perform in the game, but also just how the game actually plays, is there's not always a clean one-to-one for like, oh, this is how the input should work and this is how it should feel. Many times when you do a direct port, it actually feels wrong. It feels really incorrect. And so what you kind of have to do is almost work backwards from like a feeling and try to say like, does this character actually feel right relative to
interesting,
how they play on PC. So the most straightforward example I can point to that's like, is actually like character spell ranges. So like everything from like movement speed to, it's a different engine, obviously with different scales, we have different things. Like if you actually ported all of like the vision ranges, the character ranges, spell ranges, like, oh, I throw a knife and it goes this far, and you actually put in the ranges, it feels wrong on mobile. And so what you kind of have to do is use a bunch of kind of like relative feel kind of metrics where it's like, oh, I know that my first spell always feels longer than my second spell by like a little bit. So make sure that it always feels a little bit longer than the other spell. Things like that.
That's fascinating. Like it just being on that different kind of framing and different device, it can make the game feel completely different, and the way you're interacting with it. Is there an example of a champion that had quite a drastic change to their design to be able to feasibly feel good and work on mobile?
Yeah, for folks who do play League, Yasuo is one of our most like kind of I think famous characters on League. He's like this wind samurai guy, like very kind of like high skill, kind of like flashy outputs, like dashing through lots of units, throwing up a big wall that like blocks all projectiles, those kind of things. And there's a kind of a core problem where you have people, especially coming from League of Legends, and giving them sort of a new control scheme where they expect to be able to pull off the plays that they pulled off on PC on the first try, or else they feel like the game is like bugged or doesn't work or whatever it is. And in fact, in many cases, they actually felt it should be even easier because it's a phone game, quote unquote. And so, right, it's like, oh, why am I not even better than I am on PC? And it's like, well, you never played this before, and it's a new platform and a new control scheme, and you also don't play mobile games, right? Like these kind of things. But you have to try to make sure that they can actually feel like they do that. So a ton of work goes into on PC, we have mouse and keyboard. It's very, very precise, and people are generally used to like aiming, and if they misclick, they kind of can feel it. On mobile, two problems occur. One, there's a difference between what we call basically tap and aim for all of your spells. So if I have it's a virtual joystick and a virtual button set up on phone, and so the way that often what you do is you kind of like walk within range, and you have a intent in your mind of what you want to do, and then you tap the button, and you assume that the phone knows what you're trying to do and like where you're trying to aim. But the complexity of MOBAs is like we want to layer so many player choices of like why you would try to target a particular unit, or are you dashing towards or away or to the side or whatever. And we try to like put so much complexity in those decisions that it's really hard to mind read for players. But that's sort of like with the tap. And then with the aim, there's some other problems where you basically click the button, drag it out with your thumb. Typically, you can, if you want to be real pro, they call it the claws, right? They do the 4-fingered, like you kind of can
with
do
the
like
sleeves on them too. You can put them
yes,
on. I've seen.
Yeah,
it's pretty.
Yeah, so it's like, yeah, right. So
Yeah.
it's like movement, spells, local camera, global camera. Typically, is kind of how you want to do it for the super
For like
super
map
pro folks.
awareness and stuff like that to like check on the map.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. But when you're aiming, there's a few problems. One is where people sort of drag and aim their thumbs. There's also like kind of a nuance there between what I'll call like aiming and flick, which is like aiming is like you kind of very precisely move it like a mouse cursor and trying to get to a particular spot, and then flick is where you just kind of like throw your thumb in a direction, right?
Yeah.
You're like, I want to shoot that way. But the problem is when you track somebody's flick, because you're kind of like orbiting a thumb around a kind of a partial weird, there's like some weird joint stuff with just how human thumbs are not made for phones in a lot of ways like this. Where the player expects it to go and the actual thing they drag, if you like follow a debug and like kind of trace them, do not match up.
Yeah.
So you have to do like a lot of kind of predictive algorithm work to try to figure out like where is their actual intent and where they're going, because like this is like they're trying to actually aim like 60 degrees, but they're actually only flicking at like 40 or 45.
Wow.
So anytime you kind of do like a direct straight 1-to-1, it typically fails. And so you have to do is start there and make sure that your 1-to-1 is as accurate as possible, and then reverse engineer player intent, break down what failed and what didn't work. And we ended up having to spend, I think, about 1.5 years on just controls and inputs.
I guess principally speaking, this is like something that we already do even in PC games with mouse and keyboard, where it is precise with things like auto aim, you know.
Right.
Or in the controller world, like aim dampening when you're going to mouse over someone. The interesting thing about what you're describing, though, is it's like just like so much of, I guess, game dev and design specifically, a little deceptive, like a little tricky. Like the player might not realize, oh, you actually helped me out, that I was actually 18 degrees off, but they don't need to know, right? Because like what's really important is like they made the full motion, they responded, they reacted, and you understood what they meant. Like you knew what the brain was trying to do. So it's not like you're handicapping anybody, or giving them an unnecessary boost. You're just like trying to interpret their brain the way you're pretty sure they intended, which is interesting.
And some of these are more straightforward. So another example that I think most players don't typically know is in League of Legends, there's a concept called warding, where basically you put like a little stick in the ground. It's all weird, archaic nonsense when you think about it, but it's like you put a little stick in the ground and the stick has a little eyeball on it, and it like can see things for you.
Yeah,
right?
it
like,
gives you vision.
Yeah, there you go.
It's magic,
It's a ward.
Right. And I think that goes back to your earlier comment, about like terminology, where you're like, there's all these things just built into MOBAs. You're like, obviously that's what a ward is. And it's like, that's not what a ward is. You look at what a ward is, and it's like in the dictionary, it's like a protective circle against evil spirits or something like that.
Yeah.
Where it's like, doesn't make any sense, but it's league stuff and good old inherited MOBA stuff. But in this case, like you want to put down a ward, very often what you want to do is there's this concept called like brush, where basically it's sort of like overgrown grass and jungle where you can't see inside of it, but people who are inside of it can see out. And so usually when you want to put your ward down, you want to put it in a brush, typically. So that way when you can like see if someone's hiding in there, and also you have generally those are also placed in positions that give you very good map awareness.
Yeah.
And so when you do that, it's very common to actually miss the brush for a variety of reasons. One is just the camera angle. So I don't have enough props, but you could imagine like if like my phone is like the blades of grass, right, that are very tall and hiding characters. The way the camera angle is, it kind of angles it like this. But the actual bottom of the grass, very often what you'll do is if you put your cursor over like here, you'll actually miss the bottom of the grass. And that's just like a natural effect of having a turned camera angle. But in those kind of scenarios, what we try to do is be like, hey, you're kind of pretty close to the brush. We know you probably want it, and even if you didn't for some obscure tactical reason, like you really should. And so we actually nudge it into the brush for you. Like those kind of things are a little bit easier for us to kind of read player intent. And usually the best way to find those is to like watch sort of like player VODs, sort of like with debug on, and then try to, when they tell you what a bug happened, very often it's not a bug, it's just like an input fail, and then you have to try to kind of reverse engineer which of those you can fix and how to do it.
You wanna avoid those things like as much as possible. It's what my next video is actually about, coincidentally. I was playing Astrobot, which I absolutely adored, if any of you have played it. But what I noticed is that game effectively plays itself. Like, a lot of I noticed it in the latch mechanic. The Astrobot can get like a power up where they can use one of their extendo arms to like grab onto effectively like a grapple hook node on a wall. And I noticed that from the button press, the grab happens, the swing happens, and it will always push you in the trajectory of where you need to be, regardless of what you're doing with the analog stick. So, but when you're trying to do it in your brain, regardless of your inputs, it feels as if you're doing it smoothly and perfectly, but when you really peel it back, the game is just effectively doing it itself. But it feels good, and like that's the question. Does it matter? Like, as long as we intend something internally in our brains and then that happens, is that the important part, or is it the fact that you are actively placing that ward yourself, right? What really matters?
Oh, it's clearly the former, right? Like, it's the player. I think in almost every scenario, I think fighting game enthusiasts might disagree a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think aside from that genre, player intent really is kind of all that matters here, at least in my mind. And some of the classic examples, like they're not MOBA specific at all, but like the Coyote Time is sort of the classic controls example where you run off a ledge in a platformer and you have like a couple of frames that you can still jump even though your feet are like over the ledge. And if you don't have that, the game feels clunky and unresponsive and just bad. But players are sort of so used to it and they've been gaming for so long that there's like a lot of these like intrinsic controls affordances that really, if you don't have them, it just feels wrong, even if it's like factually correct.
Yeah, realism can really ruin things. Like, Tina or Mikey, do you guys have any examples from games you've worked on where you've kind of had like affordances given to the player where it's not necessarily realistic, but you've done something to make for a better play experience?
Yeah, I guess I could think of as you guys are talking, I'm thinking of like what I'm experiencing right now playing Space Marine 2. You guys played Space Marine 2?
I have not yet. It's on my
game,
list.
right?
I played the first one, but
yeah.
Gotcha. I played the first one too. Awesome game as well. Hell yeah. Back before 40K was cool and mainstream, we were playing Dawn of War, right? Space Marine 1. I'm so glad it made it to the mainstream. I'm not a huge 40K guy, but like Space Marine 2 is rad, and a big part of that is because they took a really fun fantasy, which is like, I'm a badass Space Marine with my friends, and we're killing everything, and we all agree on everything politically. The world is great, except it's dystopian and terrible. It's an awesome player fantasy. But one of the things that I really like they did is like they leaned into the fantasy of like being that badass by doing things like when you go to execute a guy, right? He flashes, kind of like Doom 2016. If you press the button after he's finished flashing and he's no longer in the window technically, the game doesn't care, right? They're going to give you the execution anyway. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about as you guys are describing it, is especially in like a co-op game. And yeah, as you're saying, like a fighting game, maybe it wouldn't work, but like not only should you just try to measure the intent, but also be a little forgiving because it's fine. Like if they miss it a little bit, they're not really going to complain to you, right? But as far as like a game that I worked on, Insurgency Sandstorm, we did a thing where I wouldn't say this was like fudging something, but it was somewhere where in a game that was, ostensibly realistic, or a lot of people called it realistic, we were more in the middle as far as realism and fun arcadey gameplay. We had I forget what we called it. It was like a dual ballistic system. If a bullet was going to go far enough where it would be affected by gravity and deceleration and all these other factors, we would simulate that bullet. It was different per round and different per gun, I think, because we had different muzzle velocity, etc. But if you were shooting and it was not going to make a difference, if bullet drop didn't like matter in the situation, we just hit scanned it. So it was a hybrid system. We hit scanned it because we wanted to have, even though it was going to be extremely subtle anyway, and it was a highly lethality game, by the way, like 1-2 shots, you're dead. Not a lot of on-screen elements and stuff, but we wanted to ensure that because the game was supposed to be so visceral and hardcore in the damage, etc., we wanted to hit scan it because we wanted the immediacy. We wanted the bam, he's dead.
Can you describe what hit scan is to our listeners in case they don't know?
Sure. Sorry, there wasn't like, the simplest way to put it, I guess, is like there wasn't a projectile being simulated. If you shot a guy 100 meters away, the projectile would be created and simulated, and it would actually travel to them, and it would be under the effects of real-life projectile stuff. But when it's hit scan, it's immediate. It's quick. It's like teleporting over to them.
a simple example of that in another game would be a game like Overwatch, where characters like Soldier 76 or Widowmaker, their bullets are instantaneous, so they when you fire, it will immediately hit the target that's being hit scanned. So in Insurgency Sandstorm, would you line trace the bullet and then based on its distance, then change how it was used in that instance? That's crazy computation happening, like, for both of those things.
One of our engineers who did it, yeah, he did a great job at it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
One of the other people on our designer, there's a talk on it. I'd have to go and find it, but like if you want to hear a little more about it and how we did like our customization and stuff, there was a talk either at GDC or something. It's interesting. But yeah, no, it was something where it was one of those things where as long as you understand like your game's vision and what you're going for, and you know what its needs are, you end up asking yourselves questions, or at least challenging things where you go, well, hold on, like, because our game is high lethality, because you don't really have a lot of health, and because we need a quick responsiveness to increase the tension to the tense place where we are, that's reinforced by the voiceover and all these other factors, well, we need to have certain systems. So could we do this? You only really get to a point of creating those systems when you ask yourselves questions or when you're concerned about something, right? And it's just kind of like you're saying, Brian, where it's like, well, hold on, if we're going to go on mobile, like there's a concern here. People need to have that kind of, they have an expectation, right, of control and precision, like they do with mouse and keyboard, especially if they're playing a game that's so competitive.
Yeah.
How do you do that? And it turns out the answer,
when you
it
got
sounds like
thumbs that look like this for mobile, that is messed up.
Or the
What do you mean
perfect
look
thumbs.
like this? What's
Maybe you've
They're
got those
cute.
perfect flicking thumbs.
You have normal human thumbs.
No,
dude.
I don't. I got Megan Fox thumbs.
Megan Fox
Trying
thumbs?
to
Does she
type
have
with
strange
those
thumbs?
I always
What are
hit the
Megan
wrong.
Fox thumbs? I feel like I'm behind.
Let's all compare thumbs. I feel mine's
Okay.
fine.
Here,
It's
I'll give you my
thumb.
right one. Brian, can we see your thumb, please?
Sure. I think all of your thumbs are lovely. We do-
Yeah, yours too.
We all
buddy.
have equally
you.
nice thumbs in
No-
our
no
own
thumb
unique
shaming
way.
here. We accept all thumbs. Go ahead, Jay. Sorry.
No,
That
I
was me
was,
on my soapbox.
I wanted to, Tina. You're under
Yes.
a lot of AAA NDA stuff, so I know you might not be able to say
Yeah.
things. But do you have any like examples like this?
There's a lot of nuance to shooters and how they make things feel just right. And there's a lot of, for better or worse, like trickery that goes into this, especially when you start dealing with like rubber banding and latency issues. Like the amount of effort network engineers make to simulate where things should have been, or just rewind or fast forward like in certain frames to compensate for that is insane. And as a producer, when I heard that, Brian, you said it took like a year and a half just for controls on mobile.
Mhm.
That gave me heart palpitations, but it makes
Oh, yeah.
sense.
Our producers too. Yeah.
Yeah, but the thing that terrifies me as a producer is also like, was it a lot to deal with network issues for mobile? Because the reliability of being connected anywhere on a mobile phone is always hit and miss. What was like the bare minimum that you guys had to deal with? There had to be a baseline, right? Like, because disconnecting and connecting probably happens a lot on mobile, a lot more so than when you're playing on PC or a console.
Nobody's wired, man. Yeah, it's crazy.
Although, so we did a number of things. We did play tests with with wired phones. We actually had a big setup to actually do that, just to actually test it in like sort of high latency environments, or sorry, low latency environments and high latency environments. It was really critical that we actually tested and tried to account for all the cases, because, for example, we have a pro scene, right, for both League and for Wild Rift, and all of Riot's titles typically are esports as well, and you have to assume that those are on basically zero latency kind of environments, and that those players have it feel good and be representative and actually work, but then also sort of real world scenarios, to your point. So we were I think we were more worried about this than we needed to be. We were generally, like, that was something we were very, very paranoid about. We put a lot of effort into it. We were generally trying to account for how do you play in kind of like 70, 80 ping was kind of like our general default, which if you played in 70, 80 ping, it's okay. It's not great. And I think sort of by modern internet speeds and standards, it's pretty bad. But, it's kind of a reality for a lot of folks. This is also where I think we were a little bit overly sensitive to it because of sort of just predominantly being American developers and on American mobile networks. And this is something where kind of global perspective can really change things. So the mobile network in the United States is actually far shittier than it is in like many other regions, even ones that are typically like lower income, like generally lower player spend, those kind of things. They often have better, more stable mobile networks because that's where a lot more of the focus and the infrastructure is kind of in place. So the most extreme example is actually, if I look at something like China, a lot of those players average 15, 20 latency, right, with like 0 expected disconnects. And so a lot of the stuff that we were kind of building in were actually irrelevant to large portions of our player base. So that's just like another thing to kind of keep in mind, is that the mobile networks in different regions of the world are very, very different, and the different problems like
Sounds like they're more
general
reliable.
latency. They definitely can be, and this is also where like I'm a little bit out of my wheelhouse here. I didn't work on kind of the network performance and those kind of things, but like at least not in the abstract, right? Or at least not in the specifics. In the abstract, we talked about it with the tech team and such. But there were certain areas where it's like, oh, we actually are much more worried about disconnects, and other areas we're much more worried about download or upload rates, or other spaces we're much more worried about other things. And so a lot of those we kind of had to strike team and figure out which of these what we want to prioritize. Some other stuff that's mobile specific that probably don't think about it very often is just like, what is your install size? Which like for you play a PC game now and it's like 80 gigs and you're like, I don't know, I guess like maybe I'll uninstall something to kind of clean it, like to kind of clean the space. But yeah, they'll deal with it, right? On mobile, that's not doable. And you have to kind of figure out also like, and then related to that is, when do you want to force players to update? So if you're on sort of a tethered line and on a PC, like you can basically say, hey, if you want to play the recent patch, you have to update. If you're on mobile, some players in many regions have kind of a
You're good.
yeah, okay, cool. So sorry, for some reasons, basically some players will have basically what I'll call inconsistent network connectivity. So it's like, hey, if I'm playing a MOBA's actually really low on sort of like how much bandwidth they use. It's actually like very, very, very minimal. So you actually don't have to spend very much if you're on like a mobile data plan, for example, to like play a MOBA. But if you're going to install a patch or a big update, that actually might be prohibitively expensive. And so you might need to actually go to sort of a central location and use like a free Wi-Fi at like a public facility or like a hospital or hotel or something like that to sort of do an update. And if you basically say you can't play the game until you update within a particular patch, that doesn't really work for a lot of players. And so you kind of have to worry about stuff where it's like, okay, maybe we try to build in a system that allows players to update within the next day, but not immediately when they want to hit the play button. And then that opens up all sorts of other technical considerations and problems.
Yeah.
Kind of in the same space.
That's wild, right? Like, because you've also got to think about, did you guys create different art and textures and stuff like that to specifically for mobile? Because like a lot of the stuff you're using in current league is extremely high resolution, scalable. Did you have to do different things for mobile, specifically for like size variations?
Yeah, it's something I wish we had actually done more of, frankly, relative to some of the other stuff. This is where I kind of mentioned the prioritization issue of just like, were we overly worried about ping when we might have been more worried about just like file size, optimization, latency, like install size, those kind of things. And a lot of that kind of stuff, there are definitely ways around it. So like there's streaming data kind of like when it's live, for as an example, you might not need every character in the game if you're never playing those characters. So maybe you kind of like hold off until you actually see that character in sort of a game, and when the game's loading, that's when we stream the data in. There's like lots of like little kind of technical techniques.
Yeah.
Again, I'm a little bit out of my wheelhouse on this, but there's a lot of techniques you can do kind of like that. If you want a crazy story from like kind of like old League of Legends days, we used to actually, because patches were a big deal, especially for a lot of our PC cafes, we would actually pay people on bikes with thumb drives to like literally like they would go to a central like hub where Riot would hand out the patches on like USB sticks, and then people would on bicycles go across the country and like plug in and update all the PCs in a PC cafe manually.
That's so
the
cool.
most cyberpunk thing I've heard all month.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Rad.
Have you seen the latest league patch? I saw him the other day. He was on his bike.
Right,
is
but it was one of those
insane.
things. It was like, hey, the patch drops that people want to play, so it's like you have a couple-hour downtime window. So you get people at like 3, 4 in the morning, like almost like like the newspaper folks, right? The old classic like newsboys are like throwing the papers out the window. It's like, oh, you're like throwing the USB drives out to be like, oh, it's patch 0.15, like let's go.
Deliver
those kind
the
of things.
data.
Who broke my
Like,
window? Oh,
I
it's
knew
the
that was a
1.0
thing.
patch.
That is
to leave.
fascinating.
I love that so much. That's amazing. So this is something I wanted to talk to you about because you've been on with Riot for a very long time. And something you've said before is how when you started it, Riot was very much basically an indie company. Can you
When
talk
you
to like what
start
that
at
was like?
Riot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I joined in 2010. So it was after League launched, but not by a lot. So we were in, I think, season 1 of gameplay. So yeah, I mean, as sort of an example there, like, I think when I joined, we were just shy of 100 people. We were like 80, 90. So not like indie, but still like, we didn't really have any particular investors. Like the company was still very much like, we don't know if we're going to survive another like 3, 4 months, like kind of like that level. And it was like very, very scrappy. Sort of, I guess, as an example of kind of like how scrappy it was. When I joined, they put me on, basically every designer was working on champions because champions were kind of our only, they were really our only, not just bread and butter, they were our only monetization, really. Like we had skins, and nowadays like cosmetics are pretty understood and kind of mainstream, and like they can support a product. Back then that was not true. Cosmetics were like 5% or less of our general revenue. It was still like box product was a huge part of it, right? Like go to Target and buy League of Legends in a box.
Oh my god.
It was still a huge part of our revenue. And then sort of like the weekly champion, or sorry, the bi-weekly champions that we dropped. But like
Bi-weekly?
Bi-weekly as in every 2 weeks.
That's still fast.
That's still
It
insane.
feels
Oh,
fast
yeah.
to me. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it totally is. It was too fast, right? And
Yeah.
the general mentality
Sorry,
was
I'm just surprised. That's crazy.
No, I recall seeing how quickly new champions would come out, and I'm like, why do you even need to NDA me if it's gonna be out next week? Like it's fine. Like I'm
Don't
not gonna
NDA
leak this. It's fast enough.
I don't have time to leave.
Yeah.
that was also, I think, a little probably back in the era where it was like, we really wanted to, we're a real game studio. Like we swear, like here's some NDAs and stuff. Like you don't really need it, right? It wasn't
That
really
was
that
the
big a deal.
old Santa Monica office. Right?
Was it we've had several offices. So like the Santa Monica office was actually pretty nice. It was like a real office. I was in the one before that, which was just like a hole in the wall, right?
Oh,
Where basically
really?
like, it was like we had a small little office. It's like I was actually mentioning to Jay earlier that like we would just have like players show up because like, our office address was public.
because they would Google it and
Oh
like
my.
just
Right, they just Google it. It's like I
feedback
want to
in
go.
person.
It's like, oh, I want to contest my ban. Where is Riot Games? And they'd Google it, and they like just
That's
like
what they
walk
came
into your
for?
desk. Sometimes, yeah.
Oh man, I've had that happen both in like I was in a studio in Amsterdam where I thought like we'd be cloaked enough, like people wouldn't know about us enough, and then at our studio in Canada, and it's always a little bit uncomfortable, and it's a weird thing to handle. How often would that happen for you guys? Because it only happened to us like a couple times.
Oh, pretty often. So a lot of it, especially back in early league days. Obviously, we're in LA, which is pretty accessible. There's a lot of people in LA, and also our audience was predominantly North American players. So that was where the majority of our player base was. So there was a higher like player to driving vicinity of the Riot office ratio than I think there is nowadays, right? Where
And
we're
everybody's got
more global.
cars.
Right, exactly. But like we didn't have any, door staff or like, security like that. So like there was actually
Security, really, right? Yeah.
yeah, there was actually a security at Riot Games email list back in the day where it was just like 5 dudes over 6 feet tall, myself included. So I was like security, right? And they would just like send a ping to security, and you would have to like, if someone showed up
Dang.
randomly, just to kind of talk to folks. So it was a little bit wild, kind of from that front. But if I like even think about it sort of on the balance, like I started on the balance team, and just sort of as context, they're like they put me in the balance team as like a new design hire intern person because like, well, it's the balance team. What harm can you do, right? Just kind of like go wild. A very different era from games, but like updating games was not really viewed as that big a deal, and live service and retention were not really a thing. Game seasons weren't a thing. Like patching was like still really unusual. Like the fact that not even just champions, the fact that we patched every 2 weeks was like pretty insane.
Yeah.
And it caused a lot of logistical. It was kind of a nightmare to develop in, right? Because stuff's just like always going out all the time, and you're like, you have basically like 3 days before, 3 days after, 1 day of like breathing room, and then 3 days before the next patch, 3 days before, and then after, and like it was just this constant cycle. But in that era, there were like, just in terms, I'm sure this will make your production, your inner producer cry.
I'm already hurting.
Okay, so I instituted a rule called the rule of two back in the day when I first started, which was if you are going to put something into the live game, tell one other person.
Oh, Brian.
Like, you don't need approval. You don't need to say check it. It was just like, just tell somebody. It could be QA. It could be your producer. It could be someone else on the team. Just talk to one other human being about the changes you're putting into the game.
So there was like no locking system or like.
Not really. A lot of that kind of infrastructure that I think is like pretty modern standard of like how to actually patch and ship a game was really not a thing. So like when I started, as an example, like basically anybody who had build access could just push anything to the live environment whenever you wanted. So
that's some Wild West shit. That's like more Wild West than the 90s, because at least they had to ship on CDs.
This is why people were showing up.
You did have boxed copies at this point, right?
We did. You know that like
we did. We had boxed
that
copies.
meme of a guy like grabbing his neck, like, oh my god.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Yeah, that's insane. How quickly did that stop once people started threatening your lives with balance patches?
I mean, we got better pretty fast, right? But it was also one of those things where it's like there was no industry standard for these kind of things, particularly if you're a tiny, scrappy indie team that, we didn't know how long the game was going to go. We didn't really know, like, there wasn't like good reference points we could point to be like, oh, this is how you do it. So in many cases in that, we were actually kind of in the forefront of like actually going into the tech and actually trying to like create and work with a lot of third parties to build some of these solutions of like how to actually patch a game, how to do like, account control, versioning kind of stuff. Like if we need to roll back a patch, how do you do it? A lot of this kind of stuff just was not standard.
You were learning on the fly.
Exactly. And that was where, you kind of look at League's development and it was like, how much content did we actually ship relative to sort of like the size of the team? And especially in that, I think kind of 2010 to 2013 era in particular was really the growth phase where the game was exploding. We were trying to figure out how to do stuff. And then a lot of things like just, we had to really kind of innovate and try to figure out on the fly for the first time.
How was your sleep schedule during this time?
Terrible.
I don't think I've ever cussed on this show. I'm like, what?
Well, I'm sorry. Like that's what I'm thinking about right now, and I hear about just the incredible amount of time. 2 weeks, Brian. Like that's just what I'm kind of thinking about. Is like the balance, and I'm curious, like what the culture was like at Riot at the time, as far as like how much time are people in the office? How much time were they work from home? Could they work from home? And like, what was the balance like for you guys? And how many were there as well? Maybe that's a good first question. How many were there, and what was the balance like?
Sorry, what do you mean? How many were there? Like how many?
Oh, just staff total.
Employees, designers.
Oh, employees. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
You
so
must
employees...
have had like 3 legends, or not legends. 3 characters in flight or something, right? So you picked like one to go out in the 2 weeks time frame.
Oh, I mean staff, like employees.
Oh yeah. Employee-wise, when I started, we were about 80, 90. And then, we were kind of accelerating pretty quick. So I think kind of in that growth spike kind of phase I'm talking about, the sort of 2013, 2014 era, we probably hit 300, I think, total, probably across the company. Like we were growing really fast. It was kind of like a, doubling the company size like every 2 years or so, I would say.
Got it.
Kind of in that space. And then nowadays, we're at probably 4,000 plus or minus.
How many thousands, right?
I don't know, right? It's some large number where I no longer know everybody, right? Kind of in that space. But in terms of like the actual like the character cadence to your question, we typically had, I'd say the average champion was probably in dev for about 4 to 6 months. Some were way shorter, some were way longer. So we actually probably had about 10 characters or so, kind of in the pipe.
In flight.
Yeah, at flight at any given point in time. And then in terms of like the sort of balance release cadence, those kind of things. I mean, to your point, that was every 2 weeks. And then usually we'd spend about a week fixing the last patch, and then the next week getting ahead on the next one.
Right. Well, I meant more like work-life balance.
Oh, it was
like
terrible.
The work culture. Yeah. Talk a little bit more about that. Like that's what I was curious to hear about these companies pre massive branded success that's mainstream that everybody knows about. What was it like for you guys at that point?
I think it varied pretty widely based on sort of what part of the org you were in. So there was sort of a subsection of the team that was sort of the, like what I would call the live service part of the team. So it was like, hey, there's bugs on X, Y, or Z thing. We need to fix them. Servers are up, servers are down, those kind of things. That was maybe about a third of the company or so. I'd say maybe about 20%, 30% were kind of like your, like what they call with general enterprise. So it's like, you know, HR, business, marketing, those kind of things. And obviously they were not as like, oh, the servers are down, let's call marketing, right? Like marketing had their own problems to deal with that were very serious. I don't want to like undersell their
Sure,
you know,
sure,
their work,
yeah.
their role on it. But like they generally were not kind of in this. They had very different games and different problems to deal with. And then about a third were kind of like more forward facing, like big features, new game modes, those kind of things. And I think those tended to have a more standard industry experience. So it was, you know, you start off a little bit lighter, you have a rapidly approaching deadline, things get worse and worse and worse and worse, right? Then you crunch, and then you breathe and collapse, and then you kind of repeat that loop. But the live service was just on fire constantly. I think it was probably a little bit worse for me personally, because one, I was consistently on the actual like live game in terms of like bug fixing and balance, but also my SO worked in the NOC, and so all the NOC is the network operations center, so the folks that monitor the status of the servers, and so I knew all the NOC folks, and so they're like, oh, there's a problem on live, let's call Brian.
Oh,
right, so like
no.
they had my number, and so I was like sort of like the go-to call person for anything that was like
Fires.
gameplay related that popped up. And 9 times out of 10 I couldn't fix anything and I wasn't the guy to call, but they were like, oh, I bet you know the person to call. So I tended to get called to a lot of those, like, you know, really late night 3 a.m. crisis call hotline things. Oh yeah,
That late?
I mean it's a 24/7 live server game, right? Like something happens and something explodes, the server goes down, someone discovers an exploit, anything like that. It happens anytime. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right,
that's
I guess what I thought
unusual
by
for
that-
service games.
So you weren't just the point of contact for like a design problem, you're saying. You were the person who knew the person to resolve whatever the technical issue might have been for the game going down.
It depended on sort of some of the issue. So if it was like within the game, typically, so it's like if it was between the load screen and the victory defeat screen, I was sort of like on call. If it was sort of like the servers just crashed, I mean, I can't do that. That's not my thing. So
Got it.
I would say it was definitely not everything, but it was a decent subset of things. And for some of the stuff that was more urgent was less about like, oh, the servers are on fire or capacity issues. We had plenty of those. I didn't get looped into those. It was usually more like we found an exploit or a hack or a cheat that's affecting gameplay, and we can't just like let that linger for 9 hours, because typically when someone finds an exploit in a game, we're way better about it now, but you know, it's very rough and tumble, like, you know, kind of back in the day. It starts with like 1 or 2 people and then it explodes exponentially, right? And then someone, you know, hey, drops a file on Reddit, they're like, hey, here you go, like here's how to cheat, right? If you don't kind of address those things and plug those holes quickly, you run into cascading problems.
And you get into problems about like having to make big company decisions on whether to punish those players, and it's your job to try to minimize how many people can actually have access to those things, not just for your sake, but also the players' sake. Because a lot of the times with exploits, I think about a lot of this with like World of Warcraft and stuff. Players will catch wind of an exploit and not realize how serious the dev team is going to come down on people using those. And a lot of people can have their accounts banned, you know, because they've tried to use these things. So you minimizing the amount of time those things are up is good in a whole host of ways.
Yeah, and there's other issues too that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about too. So like if, as an easy example, if you run into a game and have a bad experience, and let's say you lose a game due to, you know, an exploit or whatever, like that sucks a lot. It is worse if you are in an environment. Also, part of, I guess, the other thing with the 3 a.m. stuff is like we're global, so our 3 a.m. might be peak time in another region. And so, as an example, if let's say you're playing in a PC cafe in like Korea, you pay by the hour. So like you can actually like literally trace it, like, oh, if my game was ruined and I spent 40 minutes on a game, it has this monetary value that I was just cheated out of, functionally speaking. And so there can be a lot more sensitivity around like how fast you address those issues, how severe are them, you know, all those kind of things. So you have to deal with stuff like refunds, like all of that kind of stuff. It gets very, very complicated very quickly.
Live service games.
Yeah, for what it's worth, back in like 2013, 14, 15, 16, staying up and being on call almost 24/7, I don't think it was that uncommon for any game that had live service, any multiplayer game. Even in prod, when I was at Infinity Ward, I would do 18, 20-hour days.
Yeah.
And, you'd pass out for a few hours, wake up, go back into the office. Sometimes you showered, sometimes you didn't. There was a few times where I would sleep under, like, my desk or someone else's desk so no one could find me. Like, supporting these games back then was definitely Wild West.
What year are we talking, Tina? Sorry, you just said some years. It was
Like
for you during
2010s. When I did it, 2012 to like 2017. I don't think it was uncommon at all. Like there wasn't the infrastructure necessary to maintain a game like that. Like the only people that I saw that had like a decent work-life balance were the single-player developers, because when you were done, you were done. But if you played multiplayer or you worked on any part of the game that involved online, you didn't really stop. You just kept going.
Yeah, in the AA space with Insurgency, we had that as well. Insurgency, Day of Infamy, Insurgency Sandstorm, like those were all online games, and they had to exist. And they had to be playable, and like, you have as few or no exploits as possible, as much as you could do, and the more games you release, the more that you have to account for, right? Even if it's not the main one that you're supporting, that was also a factor, which is tough when you have like 20 to 35 people or something. There's even a part of me that wonders if it's even that different today. But I also kind of agree with you. Like
that's what I was going to ask.
Especially intense time.
Is like how have you guys seen that positively change over the years? Like what infrastructure has been put in place for that to be better as a developer, not just for the players, because obviously it's clearly become a lot better for the players as well, but as a developer, how has that improved?
There's teams that are just dedicated to build and release now, where they're making the patches and testing them and tracking what goes in and out of them, which back then I just did that with one QA tester, for Call of Duty, like praying that it would work. I think the scale of QA now has grown, right? I mean,
it has.
Having people available to test at any hour. I've seen studios hire QA testers in different parts of the world just so you always have like a group available based on the time zone when you fix something, right? Like
Smart.
If I fix something at midnight, you have a team in Europe or something that can just jump on it.
Doesn't Larian has half their studios in different parts of the world so they can just keep working 24/7, right? I think it's Larian that have that, which is just crazy.
A number of companies do now, actually. So like I think to there's a ton of things that have improved. One, I think there's some cultural stuff where I think devs are better at speaking up about bad work life conditions now than they used to be. I think also to your point, it didn't feel unique, right, at that time. Mm-hmm. Like that was just like kind of the expected standard, and it wasn't even like anyone was forcing it on you. It was just kind of like I really fucking care about this game, and I really fucking care about the players, and I want this shit to be good. And if something goes down, I wanted to like jump back in and try to fix it, right? Mm-hmm. But I think also like just the server infrastructure baseline is better. Like the fact that you can rent, like most companies servers, that I know of, even small companies will basically rent bandwidth from like Amazon or Google or some of these cloud services. So it's like, hey, if there's a spike in players, it just accounts for it, right? And then they charge you later for it. Whereas before it was like, oh, get a guy and drive down to the server farm in Nevada and like turn on some more machines, right? Like it was like that level of like nonsense. But then I think the other one, to your point on sort of like rotating schedules, our network operationer uses it's not unique to us. We actually got it from I think other like not games, but we were sort of looking at a lot more other industries that needed 24/7 support, like medical, right, is a good example where it's like, hey, if your medical infrastructure goes down, that's really bad. And so we actually did a system they call like follow the sun, where basically it's like you do 8-hour shifts across time zones. So you basically have sort of your on-call staff in the States, and then you'd have an on-call staff team in Dublin. You'd have an on-call staff team, I think, in Australia. They had some sort of like 3 or 4 spots, and everyone sort of was operating off the same run book, the same procedures. Here's how we respond when a particular thing goes down, and you have sort of like multiple kind of teams, and so it just became much more of a standard kind of support and response setup rather than like an emergency every time. How do we scramble and how do we fix this?
And that just gets infinitely more
think
complex, right? Like the further you go down, because I'm thinking in terms of like regions and stuff like that. Like you have different servers for, you know, your US and your EU servers, or maybe Asia, and like World of Warcraft splits its servers in half between, you know, North America and EU and stuff like that. And if things go down in specific regions, obviously I'm not sure if your US team would be able to deal with stuff on like the EU server side. That would be its own team delegated for that one thing. It's like it just gets infinitely more complex the more popular your game gets, you know.
I think there's an important point there too, Jay, to answer your question. Is like, and this is just my experience, so I'm not saying it is the experience, but like what Tina and Brian are describing to me is a distinctly AAA scaling experience, right? Like once things scale up, the truest definition of AAA, right, is having the money, right? Which means once you are more and more successful, you have the money to create the teams and create the systems and the organization and the structure to deal with all these things. In my experience in AA, we don't really totally have that. So we do have the late night calls and stuff to fix an exploit or something. We also have the situations where like the stakes aren't quite as high, because like what Brian's describing is true. Like somebody's losing money and you could track it. In the AA experience, I mean, depending on how you do your monetization and stuff, it might be something you can sleep a little later for. You might not be sleeping in at the office, but then there's the other situations where you absolutely are, right? Because you know, well, shit, like if we lose 100 players, that's this much of our player base alone, right? And then it gets kind of scary. So I guess I'm just adding some context or color for my experience, but it's like, it does still depend. I think in AAA though, what you guys are saying, absolutely true. It got way better. And that does set a good standard for AA's too, even just on the technical side of server infrastructure. We benefit from that as well, of course.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other, I think, small things that just benefit the industry as a whole. Like a lot of things are just more standard now in a lot of ways. Even just like installing the game, right? It's just way easier and less error prone than it used to be like 10, 15 years ago. The fact that like if you're an indie game on Steam as an example, Steam offers a lot of built-in support for like network connectivity. They have like really good like APIs, like baseline services that you can just basically kind of plug into and solve a lot of those problems for you as well. So I think it's generally been it's been getting a lot better, I think, kind of top to bottom across the industry in that regard.
Brian, may I read a question from the chat? Someone just put something out to you from Griftrix. I have a question for you, Riot Pharaoh Pony. You are so handsome.
That's not a question.
Do you agree with that? It's not a question, but do you agree?
This must be a coworker, right?
Just put a question mark on the end.
Familiar, yeah.
You also handsome?
Okay.
Question mark?
We can go with the next question. Yeah.
You talking about installs? I've a thing about this. So before I played League, because I do play a lot of League, I played a lot of Dota 2 first, before I graduated to what I feel, and I'm not saying this because you're here, I do think League is the superior MOBA, but I tried installing League. This was like in 2012, between 2012 and 2014. I was trying to install League of Legends to just try it out because I had a friend who wasn't playing Dota who played it and said you should come try it. And every time, and this happened over a few years, every time I tried to install it, it would get to like 90% and then crash my computer.
Yeah.
And so like, and I would do it religiously at like a few times a month. I'd just be like, oh, I'll try and install League again. It would never work. And I was like, the universe doesn't want me to play League. Like, I cannot fix this. But eventually I got it installed and had a great time. But like those installs and all of those small things have become standardized and have become smoother, which is really beneficial.
Right. And that's
we
actually
have 2 questions. Oh, go ahead, Brian. You finish and then I'll read the questions.
Circling way back to mobile, that's actually one of the biggest things that I think is kind of surprising and problematic on the mobile space. Is they basically call like the basically play funnel, but basically it's like how many steps do you have to go from a player's intent to I want to play your game to actually playing the game, and what is the sort of through rate that they can sort of get between point 1 to point 2. So it's like you have to go to a website, you have to make an account, you have to download the installer, you have to run the installer, you have to patch the game. Like there's sort of failure rates on every single one of those, and what you really want is like to minimize those steps and also make sure those have as high a percent chance as possible. And if you're losing 1 to 2% of your player base on every one of those steps, you've potentially lost by the end of it 30-40% of your potential player base, depending on sort of like those kind of things. So that's a really important part of the game funnel that we don't generally talk about very much as developers, but is really crucial and doubly so on mobile, because if you're on a PC, there's I think some expectation that like, oh, it might take a minute, or if you're on a console, like you're not doing anything else kind of at the time, but man, you have a half a second mental break on phone, your ass is off the tab. You've closed the window. You've already forgotten completely. You're back on
Probably got a
TikTok, whatever it is, right?
message. Yeah.
Exactly.
I did a whole thing on this. I've done a few episodes on UI back on The Escapist. I need to remake a few of them. But Tina, I was speaking to well, I wasn't speaking to in the video. I was talking about I think it was Warzone. I don't think you worked on any of the Warzone stuff, but it's Call of Duty related. And I was going through the interaction costs to just start a match of Warzone in its own browser, in its own, operation. And it was like 7. You needed to, I think it was 7. You needed to click 7 buttons to start a match. I was just like, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. And like in Overwatch, to start a custom match with your friends, it was like 16 or 17 interaction costs. 16? Yeah, it was insane.
Oh crap.
I'm glad you bring this up, Brian, because I always say it's the unsexiest part of design or just game dev is like the fatui, right? The UI, the stuff before you actually play. And as far as like reasons to stop playing a game, it's probably the worst reason to stop playing. I would rather somebody play a game and be like, oh, this isn't for me. It's too much of this or too much of that. Fair enough, go on. But if somebody tries to get in and they just get frustrated with the install process, or they don't know where they're supposed to click, or they accidentally click into the wrong thing,
confusing. Yeah.
They're stuck in the tutorial. Oh, I always hate that. That's the fear, right?
Right.
And that stuff is so important, and we just don't think about it,
Yeah, and that's also where like you have to really think about the player experience. We talk about that a lot in games, just about thinking about the player experience, but that I would also kind of double down on that in regard to this problem in particular. So when you, Jay, mentioned that like, hey, it took me 16 buttons to get into a custom game of Overwatch with my friends. That's terrible, but also like, I don't know if I'd fix that really if I was prioritizing work for the Overwatch team, because you're invested. You're sitting there in Discord with your friends, you're trying to work stuff out. You have a lot of tolerance for jank. If I've never played the game before, I don't even know if this game is fun, and I can't figure out how to hit the play button and do something, my tolerance is close to 0. And so your churn rate and what would actually kick you out of the experience is going to be very, very different depending on sort of where you are in the experience.
100%. Yeah. That's a very important way of looking at it, right? Like, what do you prioritize? Because I think a lot of people, when they think of, a lot of players, when they think of game dev, they think of resources and time being equally divided amongst all systems of the game. And that's not necessarily how it works. You have to choose where these things go. And in that episode on UI that I did, I kind of come to the conclusion, UI, good UI does not sell copies. You cannot put "we have good UI" on the back of the box, right? But having a new character or having X, Y, and Z does potentially sell copies, which gets people into wanting to get into the experience. So a lot less resources are put towards that stuff as a whole, which is, it's understandable, but also kind of a shame. I really like your comment there on choosing which part of the UI to prioritize, though, based on what will cause that highest percentage of player exit and stuff like that. I think that's super unique.
Can I make a request? Work request for you? Okay.
Oh no. Okay.
Can I have a forgot password link on the login screen?
Oh.
I had a Google forgot password to change my password when I was trying
Someone's
to play
taking
Wild
notes,
Rift.
Tina.
I'm taking notes.
I got you.
This is the corruption of game dev. Observe players how your long sought requests on forums and stuff go unanswered, but here we are, dev to dev, and they get satisfied.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah,
One
out
of
of
the
the
perks of being
corruption.
in the industry.
This is going to be on Reddit. This is going to be ex Call of Duty dev ruins League of Legends Wild Rifts
Ruins?
mobile.
No.
Making it
Ex Call of
easier.
Ex Call of Duty dev.
Yeah, but it's Reddit,
overrides
Tina.
Community requests.
It's Reddit.
Yeah, okay.
Also, Mike, I think Griftrix might be Chris Laubach that you mentioned
It
earlier.
is. You're correct.
Okay, perfect.
I was-
All right, I was like,
I was gonna-
I knew that. I knew that.
I was gonna say that real quick, but I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah. No worries.
yeah.
No worries.
That's funny. Okay, I have questions for you from
Yeah,
the
yeah.
community. Okay, so Dark Jackal donated $10. Thank you. He says, "Thanks for the podcast, Brian. Looking at the industry at large, do you see them making mistakes you recognize from Riot's early days that Riot has solved or become better at this point? Hope that makes sense."
Yeah. It's tricky because. Oh, sorry.
I have a question to ask you that's related to this, but you go first.
Okay. Yeah, it's weird. I still think that Riot in a lot of ways is a very it's an oddity in the AAA space. So I don't think it's particularly representative of a lot of AAAs. Some good and some bad, right? So I think on the bad side, it took us far too long. We kind of wanted to, I think some of the earlier points about let's just reinvent everything. Let's kind of throw out industry wisdom. We can kind of do it ourselves, and that kind of bit us in the ass in a few times, particularly around stuff of just there were larger companies Blizzard running World of Warcraft. They were able to maintain servers that were running with way higher uptime than we were. We were we're gonna do it ourselves, right? And we kind of face planted to stuff, and it takes us a while to kind of get there.
Yeah.
I think we were also way too late on mobile, as well, kind of in that space. But I think a lot of that also stemmed from we try really hard to make sure that the people who work at the company understand games, know games, and kind of appreciate them as a medium. And that's kind of all the way up from kind of the individual people working on the games, obviously, but also even the execs, and sort of the classic, the C-suite, quote unquote. A lot of those folks are some of our most fervent, excited gamers. One of our CFO was a top 20 TFT player, right? These kind of things. There's people that just it's really, really crucial, I think, in those conversations to have the people who, are in charge of major decisions at the company who understand games and can talk about games, in varying ways. And that is not true universally, but it shortcuts and saves a lot of decisions and kind of things that you want to think that you can run into. One very concrete example I can remember was when I first started at Riot. I was probably 2010, 2011 era. We ended up having to we removed a stat from the game called dodge, which if you were around in 2010, 2011, huge controversy. But basically it was a mechanic that was a % chance when you got hit by an attack that it just missed. A little miss would pop up, right? And we ended up removing it. I was sort of told to do that. But the problem was this was also tied into a couple of characters. So I ended up having to rework those characters to account for the dodge chance. And that was where we started the update of we can actually update and change old characters. That was not a thing particularly anybody did kind of at that point. So that kind of prompted some of the character reworks and that kind of stuff that we were doing. But then the other side of it was that this was also indirectly tied into monetization. So what I mean by that is we had a system called runes that were basically you would pay with in-game currency and they would give you stat bonuses. One of the most popular stats was buying dodge. And so if we removed it from the game, we obviously have to refund players
How do you
for
refund
the
them?
lost
Yeah.
currency. Exactly.
Oh shit.
And then that would not directly come out of our wallet, but it would come out of champion sales because you could buy champions out of in-game currency or cash. And so basically by pulling that out of the system, we basically tanked the next two champion sales. And when you're kind of on a, champion to champion to keep the company afloat, that was a really big deal. And I was sort of tasked. It was okay, remove all this stuff from the game. Also, don't lose us any money. Right? I'm I don't know how to do this. I tried. I was unsuccessful. Right? I released some more runes that kind of did account for some of this. I added some lifesteal and spellbound, but we didn't have enough hooks in place to actually make a lot of new content in here. So I kind of make do with what I had. But we lost an obscene amount of money. We just got to put it that way. And I got pulled into the CEO's office, sort of the next day, and sorry, this is the president, not the CEO, but whatever, the co-founder of the company. And he was so tell me why you lost us this obscene amount of money. Right.
Oh my God.
which is obviously terrifying as like junior intern, like
Yeah.
first year at the company, and also just kind of like, but the gameplay, right? Like, isn't really the best excuse on kind of from that. But because he was actually in like very entrenched, enthusiastic League of Legends player, hit diamond consistently across like every season for the first 6-7 years, I was actually able to like talk through the gameplay ramifications of kind of like what we were going to be doing, and we had a really good sort of discussion about it. And he just kind of paused at the end. He was like, "Do you think the game is better?" And I was like, "Yeah, without doubt." And he was like, "All right, get back to work."
Well,
right.
legend.
And so I kind of ended up basically doing that. But like, that's one of those kind of conversations that if you're, dealing with kind of your typical, like, quote unquote, kind of like, the stereotypical straw man executive, right? Those kind of conversations about, that are really intangible about like game quality versus like monetization and those kind of things can't really happen. So I think rolling way back to the question, one of the mistakes that I see is that a lot of people who are responsible for making decisions at other companies don't actually understand the medium. And so that is one of those things where it's like you typically make better products, you make better decisions, and all those kind of things. And it's really, really crucial to have that. The flip side is it can also blind you in a lot of ways. And that was actually one of the things where we were too late to mobile because a lot of our leadership players, devs, myself included, were entrenched PC and console gamers. Yeah. And it was just kind of like oh, hey, we're not really like, hip with the youth, right? Kind of in that way anymore. And so it can also open up some blind spots that other folks might just be better, better understanding and faster to respond to.
Yeah.
Sorry, I saw her reaction, Tina.
Yeah, Tina looks like she's reliving something at the moment. For those of you who are listening and can't see, yeah. Do you want to share, Tina?
There was a moment at EA where there was like 12 of us that were selected to go. It was like right after EA purchased Respawn. So we're like the newbies, right? They invited us to a manager conference of some sort in Stockholm, Sweden. So there's a bunch of C-suite executives and a couple game devs, and then there's the 12 of us. Just kind of like, wow, what is this? I remember the CTO coming up to the table where Vince, Zampella, and I were just hanging out. And he looked me in the eye and said that we have to use Frostbite by the time our game comes out. And that was maybe 8 months before launch. It's my guess.
Nice.
And he's like, you have to do this. And I was freaking out because I'm just like a little old producer. I look at Vince. Vince looks at him and says, "We're not effing doing this." No.
Do you want to tell people who Vince is, for those who don't know?
At the time, he was the studio head of Respawn. Before that, he was studio head at Infinity Ward. So he's been in charge of things for a while. So just seeing his confidence in saying no, and then to EA's credit, they were like, okay, and they backed off. But like, oh my god.
Not
talking about
coming from people who don't actually understand what that would take.
The team.
Yeah. That's wild. Riffs.
I think I had a heart attack that day, but I'm glad that nothing came of it.
we were talking about trust, man, in the last podcast with Abu Bakar, and good thing EA just trusted, right? And said, all right, we got you, fine. Because think about how awful it could have been if a team made that commitment. And those kinds of commitments can happen very quickly, and it can cause a lot of pain and lead to a worse product and less fun, right, for everybody.
And that would have
Snake
happened
in the garden. Oh, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, I would also just encourage, like, I think a lot of cases, and this is not just between sort of like the sort of executive staff and sort of game devs, or I think also can occur between production and like a lot of like, artists or engineers or ICs or whatever it is. I think in general, what I would say is across the industry, there's a pretty massive empathy gap between sort of like people sort of on different sides, publishing, development, sort of another classic example where I think very often it's very easy to sort of vilify sort of like the other side, or to say like, why, oh, they're just greedy, or, or they want X, Y, or Z, or, oh, they're just like trying to, be the perfect artists, right? Those kind of things, or they kind of, and I think it's really important kind of to your comments on trust, that you kind of can dig into and ask why when some of these unreasonable asks come about, and try to kind of understand where someone's coming from, what sort of like outcomes they're operating towards and what they're going for. Because I think when you start kind of pulling apart some of those layers, you can actually start working out potentially better solutions, or at least being like, oh, I know you're trying to optimize for this. Maybe there's a better way, and we can kind of work through it that way. So
Yeah.
You as a designer saying that is so refreshing, by the way. I just need people watching and listening to know that. A lot of designers kind of stubbornly say, I'm doing this, and then, audio and everyone else is like, oh my God.
Not just as a designer, man. It's just like that's how you should, live life to some degree, right? And have interpersonal relationships. Is try to understand, oh, what are you trying to achieve? Well, here's what I'm trying to achieve. Let's be solutions oriented, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Especially, or of course, also true in a work environment. You're right, Brian. Like, yeah, those people at the top, they're not there for no reason. They have their goals, they have their needs, and we have to talk. If we're not talking, if there's not mutual understanding, company's probably not going to do well, right? Long term.
Right.
That being said, it is also true. A lot of people are in whatever position they are, whether it's the top or otherwise. Sometimes they're a little detached, and you have to explain. And then, just like I was saying, like you got to trust. Say, okay, you know what you're talking about in that avenue, fair. But here's what I know in my avenue. Here's what I got to give you. Let's find the way forward. To put it very generally and vaguely, even.
Yeah, but I think the classic example is like the executives want to push the game out too early, right? Right. Typically, we don't have that problem. We actually have the opposite problem, which is like,
right?
yeah, it's like self-publishing. It's like, no, just keep going until it's ready. You want another X amount of time, you can have it. So we tend to have kind of the opposite problem on that side, where things can just like take a little bit too long to cook and should be out earlier potentially. But I think it's if you're going to have that conversation and someone's saying, hey, we want to push this game out 6 months earlier, nobody wants the game to fail. Like nobody wants like a colossal like failure on their hands. And so if you're the developer and you're adamant that like, hey, shipping 6 months early is going to cause a catastrophic failure, it's kind of on you to make that argument and kind of like persuade and kind of go over like, hey, here are the pros and cons that we're going to go over if we make this decision. So it's just something kind of to think on, as you're kind of having some of these conversations. Like, I don't think generally nobody in the industry, as far as I've generally interacted with like maybe one or two rare exceptions, has bad intentions, kind of like at their core.
Yeah, for sure.
That's great.
That was a very good question. What a good conversation.
Yeah.
Snake in
Who
the
was that?
Garden
Thank you.
donated €2, and he says, Brian, what's your pet's name?
So I have many pets. I'm assuming they are the cats. So I have 3 cats. I'm not sure which one. If it was orange, it's either Sweetness or Squeaker. I have another one, Dust Mop, who may or may not make an appearance.
Dust
I've also
Mop,
got
what a great
birds. Oh yeah, she's very fluffy.
like that,
She'll, like
yeah.
just like roll her on the floor and clean stuff for you. I've got 6 birds, a bunch of snakes, a bunch of lizards, geckos, tree frogs, turtles, tortoise. So I've got probably 25, 30 pets.
Amazing.
Whoa,
Small little spot. So yeah.
awesome.
That's so cool.
What's
I love that so much.
what's feeding like? Like the process?
Typically pretty painless. So I would say actually the whole menagerie is less work than like one Ludo, right? In terms of just like actual effort and time. Like
Interesting.
as an easy example, my snakes eat every 2 weeks, and
Oh,
so I don't have to. And they don't care at all if I don't interact with them. They're totally content to not, have any
Wow.
involvement whatsoever. So
That's cool.
I would say maybe it's, 20, 30 minutes a day. Not a huge
Okay.
deal.
We have another question that
Interesting.
came in from 97 Riemann. I hope I'm saying that right. Donated $5. Thank you. He says, I hear many stories about the spaghetti that holds League together. Is there an internal effort / care to polish it? Thank you for the interesting view.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we actually, so this has been an ongoing effort, I think kind of from the beginning. I mean, I think no one kind of expected League to hit the kind of success that it had and sort of the scale that it had. And so we have always had a pretty large team that's trying to do stuff like make the engine less error prone, update things, add in new features, all of these, like, we really saw it a game mode. So it's like, hey, how do we make designing and building maps easier? Like that wasn't a thing that we typically did because we had one map, right? For the longest time. So you're never going to invest in like a map editor feature, right? Until
Yeah.
you start building out game modes. So yeah, it's something of those things where it's like, I think actually the League engine right now is in a pretty good state. I've worked in Unity, Unreal, and League, and I think actually generally the League engine in the spaces that the League engine supports is actually easier to work with and better than those other engines. But obviously those are more universal. So if you're trying to do something that's like much more out of the wheelhouse, I would do that. But yeah, overall, actually, the League engine I think is in a really good state because there have been teams that have like I think they call them like content efficiency now, but those kind of things that just like develop and continually update things. Usually, what we've done actually, Griftrix in chat was part of that initiative, for particularly for animation. So usually we kind of goes in cycles where it's like, oh, we really need to focus on improving the workflow for animators or VFX artists or designers, or typically designers are last on the list because we tend to just like kind of suffer through whatever and we'll just make it work. And we also tend to not ask for things. I think a lot of that falls on us, honestly. And most of the stuff just kind of works. At least you can kind of work around it well enough. But if I can't import something, I can't import something if I'm an artist, right? So you got to kind of make that work somehow. But yeah, no, there's been a continued effort, and I think it's actually in a pretty good state. I think a lot of the spaghetti stuff is kind of overblown. I think it was kind of a meme for a while, and I think a lot of the League devs kind of actually, even kind of trying to be in with the community, kind of embrace the meme and talked about it. You hear a lot of the classic stuff around like, oh, everything's built with minions, right? It's like, oh, I wanted to like, make a spell, but it's actually just a minion. I mean, it sounds jank, but a minion just is like an AI entity. Yeah. It's just an object in the world that has a location, and we just called it a minion. But like, that's in every engine. That's in Unity. That's in Unreal. They all have their own kind of specific names. So it's actually, I think, less jank than it kind of can come across. But yeah, everything has their own quirks.
And also
that kind of stuff might just get further. Or go ahead, Jay. Sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say, I'm sure that both Tina and Mikey and myself can speak to this. All games, to a certain degree, are held together by spaghetti.
Spaghetti.
Yes.
Right.
Games are barely holding themselves together at any one point, and they're ready to break, and then they are continually fixed. That is just how games work. Because
watch Old School with Will Ferrell.
Yeah.
No,
I haven't seen that.
Long time
At the
ago,
end, he does
yeah.
like a speech in front of all these people, and then he just kind of blacks out and like looks at everyone. He's like, "What happened? What did I do?" And everyone's like clapping for him. That's kind of like releasing a game.
Blacking out over 5 years, and then
like,
suddenly there's
what?
a game out. Oh my god.
Oh, it works. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also saw someone in chat dropped CUTS in all caps, which is an old Riot acronym for an engineering team called CUTS, which was an acronym for clean up the shit. Back in like 2012, 2013 era, where they basically tried to merge a lot of the general game code that had been kind of fracturing a lot, because we had individual teams that were kind of like rewriting systems and all that kind of stuff. That was leading to a lot of just like core instability.
Yeah.
That is your boy Aaron Rutledge.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, that is. No, it
Perfect.
is for sure. I see that.
I know Aaron. Right?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. Hey.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Aaron. By the way, for anybody listening or watching, let us know if we're ever a little too inside baseball. If like we drop a name and they're like, "Who the hell is that?" We don't mean to. It's just I'm doing it too. It's a very small world, as you might expect, especially in the Los Angeles area.
Yeah. I wanted to get back to Brian. You said that Riot's an oddity, and I agree, but maybe for a different reason.
Sure.
When I was in game development, even before that, when I was on the editorial side, like from the outside, Riot seemed like, it's just surprising because I don't follow like the forums and the memes and all that stuff, but it seemed like Riot had their shit together because you guys are doing so much so quickly, and it was just like a shock to me. I'm like, no one can keep up. This is crazy. Like, that's amazing, right? And then I didn't feel like anyone could really compete with League at some point, as a MOBA. I was like, holy shit, it's like the cool one. Like when you want to play with friends and you want to play MOBA, like that's the one you pick, right? And the oddity for me was just how mysterious the company felt from an outsider's perspective, especially from game dev, because in LA, devs talk to each other, and I know a few people at Riot, but like I didn't see you show up to E3. There wasn't really a presence at industry specific events. So I'm like, Riot's an oddity in that sense, where it's like you don't need anybody, it felt like, right? You don't have to haggle with Microsoft or PlayStation, It's like, that must have felt, and like, for me, I was like, wow, that's kind of liberating in some way, where you're like,
yeah,
like we're doing it live, like we do it when we want. And I'm like, damn, that's cool.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of reasons for that. If I kind of like roll back the sort of the history like on it. I think some of it was that a lot of those traditional kind of like industry markets like E3 and those kind of things just weren't effective for us. Like we had live service. Like that was, you don't go to E3 to promote your next patch in a live service game. Like that's not really what you do. That's kind of like when you want to do like a big announcement or a new game trailer or something like that.
Yeah.
And so we tended to find just a lot better success with more kind of like grassroots kind of like viral marketing. The other thing that Riot was doing that I think other industries were not doing was we were much more global than almost any other game company. And so if you were kind of in the States, you actually didn't see very much from us because we actually spread our effort out pretty thin across like the US, across Europe, Southeast Asia, Korea, China. We had global offices almost everywhere that were doing like more like localized things. And so there were entire regions, I think, to kind of Jay's point earlier, that like when League started winning, it wasn't because we had the best graphics. Like we didn't. We actually had the worst graphics, I think, out of like all the sort of the competitors in the space. We had a lot of our tech was actually worse in a lot of ways. But I think some of the big advantage, like free to play, was obviously huge. But also the fact that like no one was competing in 2/3 of the regions that we were in. And part of that was just like, you know, our machine could run on a very low spec machine, but also we just supported those regions. And so we got basically in that sort of that race for who kind of wins the MOBA space, we got like 2/3 of the world uncontested, basically, kind of in that era. And so you're seeing a lot less stuff there. I think another thing that was kind of, in hindsight, kind of almost more kind of funny is like, Riot didn't have any industry pedigree at all. So like no one was applying to Riot Games if they were like in the industry, and like it was like, oh, that's the place to work. It was like that's that weird indie studio doing that weird janky MOBA thing. And so we actually didn't have a lot of like classic quote unquote industry vets. I think our industry connections were very, very minimal. And so if you're trying to get like a good slot in E3, typically that came about because you had someone who knew someone who's like, you know, worked at, you know, Sony publishing, whatever it was, or had all these deep-rooted connections, and that's kind of how you got this access. We just didn't have that. So even if we wanted to, we couldn't. And so in a lot of cases, we kind of went to the spaces that we could, which was other avenues.
Damn, I didn't even think about that. Woo.
Quick follow-up to that, actually. You talked about competitors. What did the MOBA scene look like in the early 2010s? I know Heroes of North was one of the competitors, I guess you would say, but I don't know too much about like who the other ones might have been. What was the climate like back then?
It was pretty rough, actually. There were like a lot of, I think, pretty serious competitors at the time. So before we launched, Demigod was like, if anyone remembers that game, that was like the new hotness. That game crashed and burned pretty quickly, kind of on their own volition, but they had a lot of really innovative, cool stuff in the MOBA space. Heroes of New Earth was the most direct competitor, to your point. They were much more, I think, trying to be one-to-one with Dota. So they were trying to make more like, hey, we'll be IP distinct, but you know, they even brought in a lot of some of the old Dota devs. We had some of the Dota devs as well on our team, Ginsu and folks like that that I worked with.
Ginsu's over there. Wow, didn't know that.
Yeah, I worked with. He was one of the other guys on the balance team. I mentioned that rule of two. It was like, hey, please tell someone, right?
Amazing.
But he was in an environment that was used to like, oh, I'm the only one working on this. I just ship whatever I want whenever I want, right? And so that was kind of one of those spaces of just kind of us maturing as a live service product. Heroes of New Earth was, I think, our biggest competitor in that space. They ended up finding for a lot of reasons. I think their game just was higher fidelity, but just less aesthetically pleasing, frankly. It was a lot of like dark, kind of blurry colors, very muddy, very hard to read gameplay. But also they had a $30 box product, and we were free to play. So that was a huge deal. And then the other big competitors, there was a couple ones that were being more experimental. There was one I remember called Tome that was actually a browser-based MOBA that I was personally particularly worried about because you didn't have to install anything. You could just hit play, right? Like on your web browser. And if you were at like working a job at a bank and on a lunch break and you wanted to play a MOBA, you're probably not installing League of Legends client.
Oh my God, the interaction costs are so low. The browser.
Right.
No.
The barrier was like non-existent. Thankfully, our gameplay and stuff our characters were way better. So like the actual like experience was much better for us. And then the other two big ones that we were Heroes of the Storm, which I forget what their code name was. Blizzard All Stars, I think was, or Blizzard something. They had a code name before that, and like that was one of those ones that like we kept thinking was almost on the horizon. At almost every year, it sort of got delayed, but it was like that was a really serious competitor for us. And then another one was blanking on the name. Dota 2, right? Was the obvious other major.
Never heard of it.
Yeah, exactly. So particularly, and there were other ones too, like Strife and a few other games. So in that kind of 2010 to 2013 era was really the kind of MOBA gold rush. And so there were kind of competitors coming from all sides, and MOBA adjacent games. Gigantic, that was sort of like a MOBA but trying to be more actiony. There was a lot of stuff in that space. That was a very long rambling answer to like there was very very competitive.
No, it's good. I feel like that's something that
Great
maybe not
context.
everybody. Yeah, it's good context for our conversation, but also like as far as me personally, I remember my friends were like really into Heroes of North. I played Savage 2, I think, which was the game they had before that. If you know Savage, yeah, which is very interesting. Almost like, I don't know, that felt more like natural selection or something to me. Like
It
wasn't
was
so MOBA-like.
it was RTS adjacent. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting how like I wonder how that might have influenced them to go for Heroes of Newerth, but it's something that I think a lot of people that are listening and watching might not know too much about like what the space was like at this time that we're talking about. It was very different from how it is now, obviously, right? So it's cool to hear just how crowded it was.
Sure.
Yeah.
For the play base
Are
and
we on
devs.
time, Jay?
I have to get the see. This is where I'm going to show my jank, and I'm going to miss our beautiful, amazing producer Eric, because Eric usually has this all prepped and ready to go. I've got a link. So, Tina, can you tee up what we're about to do? Not necessarily the description.
Eric
what we're
says he
about
has
to
the
do.
pitch ready to show. Sorry, Jay. Just
I'm
Eric's
not,
got it ready to show, does he?
Proud
that's
about
what he's
this
saying
one.
in the chat. You're not proud.
Yeah, it was like a crazy week because my kid was sick, but
Does
Brian.
Brian? Yeah, go ahead.
No, yeah, I'm gonna explain. So Brian, at the end of every podcast, we end with an improv game dev pitch.
Mm-hmm.
So I show an image or a video or something very silly, and then on the spot we have to make a game out of it.
All right.
It was inspired by watching Double Fine's Amnesia Fortnite documentary.
Okay.
And it's kind of cool to see what we come up with.
Yeah, Eric has it prepped. It was going to update automatically. But before we do that, we were talking about this before, Brian, in the weeks. You have some, and I've spoken to people about this. You are a big champion of indies, and indies that are maybe not getting the attention they deserve. And you wanted to give away some codes, but we unfortunately couldn't get some from the devs. But we may still be doing that in the future. But I wanted to give you an opportunity to just shout out some games that you feel that the audience might enjoy and might love, just to give these devs some attention.
Yeah, I play a ton of indie games. I try to go through 10 to 12 games a week is sort of like my goal. Doesn't mean finish, right? It just means play enough to understand and kind of know where they're going and if I should be investing more time into them. But yeah, so like one of I think the saddest things I see is when I go to like a Steam pitch, I'm like, oh, this game is like really innovative and really cool, and then I see like 20 reviews, right? And it's like a 3-year-old game, and it makes me really sad. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to just shout out a few of these. So I'll just give a shout out to a couple of these folks. I do not have any direct affiliation with any of them, by the way. They're just games I thought were cool. The first one I'll call out is called Mythos Sudoku. It is sort of a Sudoku adventure game.
Sick.
There's also a free-to-play version that you can go. You should just if you type in Hyrule, as in like Legend of Zelda, Hyrule Sudoku, you can find a web browser version of any kind of a related space. It's the only innovative space I've seen in Sudoku, but essentially what it is basically it's a series of interconnected Sudoku puzzles where you basically, when you complete a cell, you get like an item or some kind of unlock, and then that basically lets you access or unlock another part of a different Sudoku puzzle. So you're actually juggling between 3 to 5 puzzles at any given time.
Cool.
And then each individual meta puzzle has their own unique mechanic. So it might be something like, oh, hey, there's these colored gems, and it's like an orange gem, which is like, and you have to try to figure out like what colors match up with what kind of numbers. And so it's like, oh, if it's next to a blue, it has to have one of these 3 numbers. And so it really kind of takes your mental model of like how to solve a Sudoku and just totally warps it in really interesting ways.
I'm looking at it now. I've got my browser up here. I'm checking each one that you mentioned, and I'm getting a very strong Myst vibe. It looks very cool.
Yes.
The
Oh wow,
environments.
strong Myst vibe. I'm even more interested now.
Oh, big time, big time. Like
It's
for
clearly
me, looking at
inspired,
it,
It's clearly
Yeah.
inspired by Myst for this one. The web browser obviously doesn't have that, but it has a lot of the same kind of like intricate puzzles and stuff. So
Yeah.
if that sounds of any interest to you whatsoever, that's a really cool. Like I don't really like Sudokus, but I really enjoyed this game. Another one I'll give a shout out to is called Keeper's Toll. I think the devs kind of maybe shot themselves in the foot a little bit. They changed their name halfway through early access, so I kind of lost track of it, and I couldn't figure out like what was happening. But it's just if you're in the vampire survivors genre, it's just a really solidly executed indie game, where it's just like everything from like the character design to the weapons to all of that kind of stuff is just really, really solid. And I think one of the coolest things about it is their boss design is really cool, and they also just have some really fun mechanics. Like there's a necromancer who has like a big flail, and it actually kind of responds to where you move, and if you kind of like do a turn and stop something, it will swing the mace around to kind of hit enemies. So it's just like really cool kind of like little gameplay hooks and kind of gimmicks in a space that I think can get a little bit stale sometime. And just like giant bosses that are like dragging themselves across the ground and you're running away, like it adds some cool twists kind of in that space. That one actually is about to release 1.0, I think, relatively soon.
Yeah, it's certainly access. It's going on the wish list.
Cool. Another one I'll give a shout out to is Dream Tactics, which is sort of a like magical girl dream world, like pretty intricate tactics fighting game. But it kind of just like really nice sort of like anime pixel art kind of aesthetic, and just like you fight like literally like your villains are pillows, right? That are like literally like animated pillows that run around to like steal stuff, and you're just it's very whimsical, very lighthearted. It's a really cool twist on like classic kind of fantasy tactics games. And then the character classes are all just like kind of interesting twists on kind of the basic formula. So that's stuff like you have a carrot knight as like your tank, and not only can you like do all typical tank stuff like throw carrots at people, obviously a very tank thing, but you can like plant seeds that then like grow into carrots that other people pick up, or there's like a drowsy mage and she can like make enemies and allies sleepy, and if they're sleepy they get debuffed. So you're like, why would I debuff my allies? Because then if you put a nap spell on them and they're drowsy, they heal more. Like it's just a really, really solidly executed tactics combat game, and sort of an aesthetic and a vibe I have not seen before.
Stunning.
It's a cool contrast, tactics and cute whimsy.
Exactly. Yeah. Another one I'll drop is it's actually a recent one called Edge of Sanity. It's a sort of it looks kind of has like Darkest Dungeon style aesthetics, but it's sort of Cthulhu existential horror. Something went wrong in the mines of Alaska, and you're trying to sort of figure out kind of what happened, but it's sort of a survival horror exploration team. Yeah, and it does a lot of like really good stuff where it's like, does the screen shakes and things kind of flash and like you see like eyeballs staring at you. It's very grotesque, eldritch, existential kind of horror, but very unique blending of genres. They also have like cool enemy mechanics.
The artwork is insane.
I like how you shuffle around with your axe, just like the weight of the horror on you. You just kind of stumble. It's cool.
You're not an empowered protagonist. Like you're very like quote unquote like weak, and so it's a lot of stuff where it's like there's certain enemies respond to different like lights or sounds. So you'll have enemies that are blind. You'll have enemies that are very sensitive. So you turn on your lantern and like their skin will start burning, and like how you kind of approach every enemy is kind of in a very different way. And then the last one I'll give a shout out for is called Shattered Heaven, which is a deck builder kind of like roguelike game, which is a dime a dozen kind of in the Steam indie space. And the deck building and card combat and stuff is pretty solid. Not, I wouldn't say best in class, but I think where this game really excels is the narrative, the world building, the monster design is like amazing. If you watch the trailer of it, like the production quality for this game is like off the charts. And the level of detail they put into their world building is amazing. And it's everything from like they do a lot of the really good like show not tell kind of thing where it's like there is no exposition dump anywhere. You're a little bit confused, but you get like straight into it, and like it feels really heavy, really serious, like really like immersive kind of in that way. But then the level of detail put into the monster designs, the enemy designs, like it's very like eldritch horror where you'll see like it's like a deer connected to like another deer torso that's like stretching and contorting. You see a lot of the stuff
crazy skeletal stuff.
What was
going on.
that one called again?
Crazy
Eric and me missed the
Shattered
name.
Heaven.
Shadows of Heaven or Shattered?
No,
Shattered.
Shattered. Like it
I'll
broke.
put the link in the chat.
Yeah, Shattered Heaven.
Beautiful.
I think I'm feeling a little bit of what you felt, Brian, because I look at this and I look at the art and I look, oh, branching story. Wow, so cool. Wow, look at this punches above its weight. Look at the production. 60 reviews.
Right.
It's
Right.
sad.
Yeah, and the level of detail is pretty insane. So if you look at like there's like a spot where there's like sort of this beautiful field of flowers as an example, that's a background. If you like kind of zoom in on the trailer, you can kind of see where it's like all the actual flowers actually kind of have these I forget what the actual name of the flower is. Maybe it's like a snapdragon or something, kind of have like these like little kind of like holes and almost look like a little face. It actually looks like this kind of like wailing distorted soul.
Oh,
And that
cool.
level of like detail that's like put into all of their world building and their environments is just really, really phenomenal. So I wanted to sort of call that one out as well.
Amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Those are great callouts. Holy crap!
Yeah. And
I haven't heard of any of these.
And now that we've called out some deserving indie games that I'm gonna go play, do we have time? I'm not sure if anyone has a hard out. Tina, do you have a hard out?
I did at 12, but I'll try to stick around.
Okay, well, let's try
I'm
and
good.
hastily create an indie sensation of ourselves. Eric, if you can pull it up,
Oh no.
we'll see if this works.
I think this is extra challenging because of the context. But
Okay, so, it's appeared on my screen. You guys might need to open the stream to see it because you don't have the preview.
Wait, I'm going.
But
Okay.
once we've confirmed we can all see it, Tina, can you give
can't
us
see it.
a call out?
Can you see it? I
Alright.
can't see anything.
No, look at the just look
Look at
on,
the stream
YouTube
preview
to see.
on online.
Oh, wait, what? Girl, what are you saying? I don't see it.
Just go to here. I'll just send you the link.
Oh.
Look at my link.
You want me to watch it?
Yeah, because
Like,
usually Eric would have a
Mhm.
preview of the stream for us to see, but because I have the camera set up, I can't show you the preview. So
This is just a result of our technical issues.
Yes.
Basically, I'm looking at the YouTube live link and Eric's video player, which is shown in a delightful Windows 95 style.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
so Tina,
Yeah.
give us
okay,
the
so-
rundown. What's this?
All right. So where my brain was at when I saw this. Okay. So, it's sort of dystopian because like a lot of us may not be homeowners, so we're making a game about home ownership. Okay, and I was thinking
Yeah.
mobile. Okay, we need like, a
Modern
mobile-
fantasy, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, the mobile game, right? And something that's probably not really known to our generation or the generations younger than us is what an homeowners association is and what they do. And I think for the most part, a lot of the older generation says that HOA is like an evil entity, right? So this mobile game could be it's almost like a sim where you're creating like the wackiest shit or they're trolling like your neighbors and the HOA and seeing how far you can push their buttons and get away with. And I was also thinking like maybe it'd be cool if like someone wanted to participate in the HOA and then just messed with you too, like back saying something was too pink or something.
Yeah.
That's where my head was at. I don't know
EVP.
if you guys-
HOA versus homeowner.
Yeah.
I think
Interesting.
so. My contribution to this is if we're on mobile, I say we get this in and we start making this a live service, in the sense of you have rankings for who is the worst ranked HOA building. Like, so effectively you all compete to make the ugliest house, and each week there's different criteria that you could piss off your HOA member. And there's like a ranking board who has the ugliest house and stuff, and then you win prizes based on your ranking, and then you get like either more money to buy more ugly things for your house, or you win a special trophy that can be like the Optimus Prime, right, or the Bumblebee. That's a prize 1 week for having the ugliest house or something like
Yeah,
that.
and we probably can't get the intellectual property rights to that, so it'd be like Bumble Bay. I don't know. What do you call it?
Bumblebee.
Bumblebee.
It's
Bumblebee.
pink.
Yeah.
So what kind of let's start a bit at the bottom. So is this like it's a strategy game, I guess, or it's like a sim game? It's what's the perspective that we're thinking about for how we're making these changes, how we're creating the
Sim?
yard? Sim? I'm thinking
Potentially?
something like SimCity-ish, but like obviously way zoomed in. I'm trying to think of a better
More
example.
of just like The Sims, right? Like building the house, or maybe you have a house,
Okay,
but you're
yeah,
more
yeah.
of placing items. You're painting things. You're,
Brian wants to jump in.
yeah.
Oh, I mean, yeah. So a few things stand out to me, right? I think immediately, like if we're talking about homeowners association versus just like kind of a more like a design home, this really to me is focused on the exterior of
Yeah.
the house, not the interior, right?
Yeah.
So, I do think actually to Mikey, your point, I think PvP is probably correct here for this game,
Hilarious
and you actually
idea.
do want to make it competitive. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that are really interesting, like foundational like components that you can do here that really are conducive to high retention, high engagement style games. So one, I think asynchronous PvP is probably correct here, where it's like I can have any number of sort of like homes in different neighborhoods with different player groups that I'm sort of competing with simultaneously. You do some sort of check-in where every day something happens. The HOA like gets to like make judgments on particular houses or can find things if they change different rules or whatever. But that way you can kind of you can take your time, because on these sort of decoration style games like a design home, you really want to like be able to take your time and be able to kind of like breathe and kind of like experiment and like try things and kind of like work around, and you want to be able to do that. But I also think, Tina, to your point, like I love the idea of having this sort of be, you're almost like competing against like a referee kind of like rule setting entity, but the players are also like one of the core components of an HOA is that the people who are in the HOA are in theory have voting rights and can like manipulate things or change rules. And so maybe you're trying to like spend money to influence other people's neighbors, or maybe you're like, hey Tina, Mikey, like Jay's house is fucking pink, right? We don't want any pink houses in this neighborhood, so let's all work together and let's vote on no pink houses like for the next day. And then then Jay gets a fine, right, for like those kind of things. And it's almost like this political intrigue combined with like decoration game.
Yeah.
That I like what you're describing, because what I'm
Wow.
hearing and what I'm
Yeah.
imagining is, first of all, Brian, that was perhaps the most delightfully serious and
Eloquent.
concise and eloquently explained hints that we've
Yes.
had so far in this. So thank you for that. It speaks to your role and your skills. So bravo.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to
Also-
work with you one day.
Yeah, it's yeah, I'm imagining like kind of like you're describing, like it's round by round, like okay, the rule now is no pink houses, let's see him deal with that. And then we go to Jay and he's like, well, they didn't say no magenta, and then he does magenta house or something. It's like you're outsmarting in this weird house chess game of trying to get around the rules that the HOA keeps setting, and being the most obscene as possible, or something, maybe not obscene, just
Yeah.
like the most right in the line, being as running up to it but not totally violating, because then you would lose or whatever.
They just remove your house,
Or you
right?
make a style of make a style of window, right? And it's like, oh, we actually don't want shutters on windows, like that's not okay. And then you have to start making tactical choices, like, well, is it better for me to just like remodel all of my windows on the first floor of my fantasy house, or should I build a fence, right, and actually like block off that part of the view from like the street view or something
Yeah.
like that? There's a lot of like, I think, perspective play that you could also kind of build in here, which could be interesting.
Yeah, I think an interesting point you raised is like with the type of genre, you want the time to be able to like think about these things. But I also think an interesting thing with like HOA is that they could just show up and knock on your door and like have that row with you at any point. And I love the idea of like someone being in a meeting at work and like having a terrible time, and then they get a notification on their phone and they look down and it says the HOA is at your door, and it's like you get these inspections that come out of nowhere and you're like, oh, I've got to go to the bathroom because the HOA's here and they're inspecting my property. I love the idea of it being a little bit more, I guess in a way, like half of it's player driven and PvP, but the other half is like the game wanting to bring you back in and like, hey, you need to pay attention to these things. I think it could be interesting.
I think player influenced like rule setting is sort of the correct kind of approach here.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
you have the game is doing something on its own, and then the players have the ability to sort of nudge that rule set.
Moderate or alter.
Right, or like
rule
use their
sets.
influence and political capital, right, to be able to sort of like push for a particular thing. Maybe like, hey, you pull up a bunch of like political resources, and now I can order an inspection on this person's house like the next day, like those kind of things.
Yeah.
Whereas if you didn't nudge it to be random, like things like that, I think there's a lot of potentially cool stuff there. But I think if the players don't have at least a little bit of agency in the rule set, it's going to feel more functionally random.
Yeah,
right? Which I don't
100%.
think is going to feel that good, but I think could be really empowering, almost like social deduction, kind of like, take that style of like play you see a
Yeah,
lot of board games.
who is it in my friends list that called for this HOA inspection? Somebody called for a meeting to make this happen. This doesn't happen by random, so then it causes more of that drama of like, who did this and why. I bet it was Susan. Susan's always trying to fuck with my house.
Right.
Oh, Susan.
Bloody Susan.
Yeah, it was her, wasn't it?
Yeah, your drapes are gross, by the way,
the-
Susan.
I'm picturing the kind of political environments that develop in like not old school necessarily. The lineage of MMO games that came from like Ultima Online, like Dark Age of Camelot, and all the open world full loot PvP games where like people would have to protect their territory, so they form their clans, and inevitably there would be the politicking and stuff that happens on the forums and
Right.
shit. But I'm imagining that expressed with like the homeowners associations and them competing and fighting with each other. And also when you mentioned like ordering the inspection, this isn't like PvP focused necessarily, but it would be an interesting spin if you allowed NPC interaction. But like an you guys play Alpha Protocol, Obsidian game?
I don't think I
2010.
played
My
that.
friend
Oh,
worked on it.
yeah.
Oh, really? Yeah, it was a spy game. You were a spy, third-person action game, and you have to have conversations with people, and you're not necessarily like trying to answer the right answer every time in conversation. You're just trying to work toward a certain outcome or get the person to a reputation level that is conducive to what you need out of them. Like make them dislike you to piss them off, so they go back to the HOA and they say, we need to put more money toward this guy. And then that means you bought your friend some time with his house because now they're going to be focused on you or something like that. Like getting deliberate outcomes. Disco Elysium might be a better, more like a modern example of that. But like a conversation game, because when I think about HOAs and homeowners interacting, you kind of have that sort of, hi, how are you? Like niceness that's really like sort of like a feint or like fake, because in reality you're trying to like figure out what this person's doing to you and how they're manipulating you, like the socio-political angle, I guess, of it.
When I think about this game, I think about what the emblem editor as a feature was in Call of Duty. Working on it, moderating it, dealing with like community, creations, and then like where do you decide to promote like what people have created, and is that a bad call because in like 0.3 seconds someone made like a penis and now it's everywhere. I get the like feeling that this game would have those kinds of issues, or like maybe it's not an issue, maybe that's an exciting thing.
It feeds
Yeah.
into it, right?
Didn't the Romans put phalluses like on their yards and stuff? I'm pretty sure as a sign of virility.
I think
I'm
we
gonna look that
can
up.
use it, right?
Roman phallus.
Go ahead and show it, Eric.
Well, if whoa man, what are we showing?
When you guys said fat cats, someone running the HOA board, I thought of this
Nice.
character. This
Amazing.
guy.
Yeah, we could Animal Crossing this pretty easily, right? Just like make all the characters like.
I think that is a strength, right? Say we have community made things and somebody makes a penis, right, and then it's everywhere. You can use that in the narrative of the HOA for taking it down. Like the HOA have deemed anyone using this image as inappropriate for our neighborhood, so you are being fined X amount of money for in-game currency for using it, right? So it's part of you have to think, is this too rude for the HOA? Is this pushing over the line, right?
Well, it's kind of at its
That's hilarious. Go
I
ahead,
mean,
Brad.
at its core, I mean, what you're basically talking about is almost like community moderation, right?
Yeah.
At its core. And so this is something that like a lot of phone games will do, where you basically, you get basically snapshots of a particular house or a particular whatever item you're creating in one of these worlds, and other players get to basically vote on it, whether, oh, this is awesome, or this is not awesome, or, oh, this is offensive, and report it, right? Like those kind of things. And it almost puts kind of this kind of self-policing kind of community style thing, where you're almost designing for an audience. You're not designing for necessarily your own aesthetic and your own self. And that actually takes a lot of the weight off of the game developers in terms of trying to say what is a good house or what is not. It's like, no, what's a good house is what the community thinks a good house is. And that I think that type of approach is like much more robust and much more fair. Also, to be honest, than saying,
Yeah.
you know, like a lot of those games where it's like, I need to build a house with 100 comfort points, and then someone puts like 10 benches stacked on top of each other in a corner, right? And it's like, oh, well, technically it's 100 comfort points.
Yeah.
Like you just kind of get to avoid a lot of those kind of like very game designery problems, and you kind of pull the designer out of it almost entirely, and you focus on that kind of community vibes aspect, which I think is really powerful here.
This is the first pitch that we've done where I've actually been like, this could be a game and be successful. Like this could, as much as I love our what was he ass blast, what was he Mike
Ass
the ass
Blast.
blast dude?
The game was simply called Ass Blaster.
Ass Blaster.
that was
Like
with
I would play that,
Sorry.
but I don't necessarily think it'd be successful. I think this could be an
Does Brian know
incredibly
about Ass
like
Blaster?
HOA
I saw
simulator.
that
Describe it.
episode,
Okay, 'cause
yeah.
you saw it with Wilson Chung.
I
Yeah.
did, but I mean, if you want to, you can describe it for the audience.
No. It's. I guess I should. Yeah.
We
Ass
nearly
Blaster
scared a
was-
Bubakar off last episode by describing that episode. I
think he
genuinely think
secretly liked it.
HOA Simulator
cringed
could
for optics.
actually be a good mobile game. Like, I think it could
Yeah?
be- yeah, genuinely.
Way to go,
I think
Tina.
I think there's potential there for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of those games are actually very, very popular.
Yeah.
And so this is kind of would be an interesting kind of twist on that potential
But
format.
what
100%.
would you call it? We don't even have a name for this yet.
Oh, let's think of the name. I think we need to reference the fact that it's competitive somehow, right? Leaning into that with the name. I'm just putting up some guidelines, just throwing them out there.
You know how
Something about
there's that old phrase, keeping up with the Joneses
Yeah.
implies that you're
Yeah.
trying to, you know, like get what the neighbor has or better. Maybe
Yeah.
there's something in there.
We're trying to
Keep-
push like
could
the HOA diplomacy.
Yeah,
Right, like trying to
HOA
like really kind of
diplomacy.
push more of the kind of like political, more like
yeah. There's
competitive.
some fun marketing there.
Oh,
you guys know
amazing.
games like Suzerain or the geopolitical games where it's like a bunch of different diplomats with suits and stuff and a map in the background. I'm picturing that, but parodied as like people in their homes in generic Anytown, North America, or something like that.
Yeah, it's like a dinner table with loads of like HOA members sat at the dinner table trying to look polite, but secretly have like daggers underneath the
Yes.
tables and paintbrushes and shit.
I like what Tina said. I maybe just this is a little terse, maybe, or not terse, just short. Keeping up, something like that. Because there's a little. The game's not urgent, as you said, Brian. Like it shouldn't be. Like you need time, and it should be turn-based. But I like the idea of like I better get on at some point within this week because the round will end. I better find the time. I'm seeing some suggestions in the chat actually.
While Karen appears. That's messed up.
Homeowners
feel like-
assault. That's a little aggressive.
Yard wars.
Well,
I like yard wars.
What'd you say, Brian? Sorry.
Oh, there's something in there is if the acronym can stay HOA, I think that would be really
Oh,
exciting.
I
Okay.
like that. Hate away.
Homeowners assault.
Hate away. So it's hate away.
HOA. Oh, they're also
Naughty
good.
nautical neighbors. But we're not on the ocean. Why would it be nautical? I guess you could be on the ocean.
This is great. Oh, I
Really,
love
this is the one, Jay, that you see that's like the most potential.
all of them could be games. Like we're all professionals, and I know like we could actually make all of the ones we've come up with. But this one, I'm like, I could see this doing well on mobile with like a lot of people, and it being a success in a way. Obviously, it would need a lot of work, but I'm like,
Nah.
there's an idea here, right?
No, you don't think so?
Ready to
No,
ship,
no, just ship it.
ship
Yeah.
it. Hey, it's
people
community
place
driven,
their
right? So we
building.
just put out
Play some
an
cutesy
editor
music.
and say go.
Oh
Amazing.
my god. I would love to make the next like hat store from Steam, you know, but like in a mobile game.
Yeah.
People making like
Oh my god,
home.
who's made the Bumblebee, the
Beaches.
Bumblebee boy statue? Oh my god, who made that?
that's how you get away with intellectual property, copyright infringement.
Yeah, community made.
I had a thought. This is like a different pitch, but I just want to share because it was funny to me. The idea of like, what if this game? Because I was looking at the picture that Eric shared, and it looked like an AR thing or an MR thing or whatever. And I imagined like, what if the game were an AR game, and like the idea was you take basically everybody's competing to have the most viral, most ridiculous yard. And they, get their phone up and they film their yard or whatever, and then they populate with whatever ridiculous things. And then there's like a vote or just an algorithm that's going to choose whatever's the most engaging. And so the idea is to actually piss off your real HOA by making them public across the internet and associating them with your ridiculous and obscene AR yard. Something like that.
There probably actually is some like commercially extremely lucrative product here in that sort of AR space that you're kind of suggesting. Almost like I'm going back to Design Home again because it's like a really popular, good example on a lot of these kind of things where you have like an alternate reality or where basically you can hold your phone up over your house. It's again assuming you have one, right, in this fantasy world, or a virtual house, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. And then you can actually see and try the differences, and it can actually sort of apply the filters over whatever your particular thing is. And then there's a link to buy these in the real world, right? Option to like sort of like test out and kind of like make your kind of virtual establishment, and then you basically link that elsewhere.
IKEA's coming for us.
That's a potential option.
They're taking this idea.
Those partnerships are very lucrative. I've never done a partnership with IKEA, no plans to, but I've heard they do well.
What's this IKEA League of Legends crossover we're getting?
Yeah,
the IKEA League crossover.
The new skin line.
Yeah, this may be the first game idea someone steals and actually uses from our show.
Yeah. Well, if you do, hey, if you see this and you're stealing it, at least put us in the special thanks and give us 0.5 royalties.
Yeah, give us some currency.
Yeah, in-game currency.
A little free currency. How insulting.
Oh, God. Okay. So we've gone way over our usual time, mainly because of my technical faults, without our dear Eric, who is in the chat listening to us. Hello, Eric. But just couldn't because of internet shenanigans. So we've ran over, so I will have to cut us off there. As much as I've absolutely adored this, Brian, thank you so much for joining us. This has been fantastic.
Awesome. Thanks for having me,
Brian.
Yeah. Do you guys have anything you want to say before I sign us off? All good?
Come back on the show, please. This was fun.
This was a lot of fun, Brian. Thank you so
Awesome.
much. It was really cool chatting with you, talking history, talking design, talking everything. Thank you.
Hell yeah. And everyone in chat, thank you so much for joining us. We massively appreciate you. Thank you for all your donations and everything. And we will see you in the next one. Bye.
Bye-bye.